Good evening, fellow travelers through time. Tonight, we embark on a journey, not of adventure and glory, but of grim reality. We will explore a period that often fills our minds with images of grand ships, heroic captains, and boundless discovery. The age of exploration. Yet beneath the veneer of triumph and ambition lay a world of unimaginable hardship, disease, and death. A world so brutal, so unforgiving, that if you were transported back, even for a single day, your chances of survival would be infinitesimally small. Close your eyes if you wish, and let the gentle hum of history lull you into a state of contemplation. We begin our perilous voyage not with the excitement of discovery, but with the terrifying act of departure itself. Imagine, if you will, the bustling docks of Lisbon, Seville, or Bristol. The year is perhaps 1500. The air is thick with the stench of fish, tar, and unwashed bodies. You stand on the quay, a new recruit, perhaps a farmhand lured by promises of riches, or a desperate soul fleeing debt and famine. Before you, bobbing precariously on the water, is your new home for the next year, 2 years, or perhaps for eternity. It is not the majestic galleon of movies, but a cramped, wooden coffin, barely 30 meters long, its timbers groaning even before it leaves the safety of the harbor. These ships, carracks and caravels, were masterpieces of their time, yes, but they were also incredibly vulnerable. They were tiny, fragile shells, entirely at the mercy of an ocean far more vast and unpredictable than anyone alive could truly comprehend. You look up at the mast, a towering spire that seems to scrape the clouds, and feel a shiver of dread. This is not just a ship. It is a leap of faith into an abyss. Your first challenge begins before the anchor is even raised, the sheer act of boarding. There are no gangplanks as we know them, perhaps a rickety plank thrown across, or a scramble up a rope ladder, your meager belongings clutched in a canvas sack. The deck is already teeming with a motley crew, hardened sailors with sun-weathered faces and missing teeth, grizzled veterans of coastal voyages, and other unfortunates just like yourself. The air is tense. Orders are barked in a language that might be unfamiliar, a dialect thick with maritime jargon. You are immediately assigned a task, perhaps hauling a heavy rope or scrubbing a deck already slick with grime. There is no time for pleasantries, no gentle introductions. Your value is measured solely by your immediate utility. Fail to pull your weight, and a boot or a fist might quickly remind you of your place. Discipline on these voyages was absolute, often brutal, and entirely necessary for survival. A single mutinous thought, a moment of insubordination, could mean a swift, unforgiving end. As the last lines are cast off and the sails unfurl with a crack like thunder, the land begins to recede. The familiar coastline shrinks, houses become specks, and finally, even the distant hills melt into the horizon. You are truly alone. The ship becomes your entire world. And what a world it is. Below deck, the living conditions are horrific. Imagine a space so confined, so dark that you can barely stand upright. The air is stale, thick with the smell of sweat, unwashed bodies, bilge water, and the omnipresent scent of rats. Your bunk, if you are lucky enough to have one, is a narrow shelf shared with another, perhaps 2 others, rotating shifts. There are no private spaces, no moments of solitude. Every movement, every sound, every breath is shared with dozens of other men. This forced intimacy, coupled with the constant fear and discomfort, quickly breeds tension and animosity. Small arguments could escalate into violent brawls, and justice was often meted out by the captain's hand or by the unwritten laws of the sea. The food. Oh, the food. Forget any romantic notions of grand feasts or fresh provisions. Your diet would consist almost exclusively of hardtack, a brick-like biscuit made from flour and water, so hard it could break teeth, often infested with weevils. Salted meat, so old and tough it was barely edible, would be your main protein. And water, precious water, stored in wooden casks that often leaked or became fouled, would quickly grow stagnant and green with algae. Malnutrition was not a theoretical risk, it was a certainty. Scurvy, the dreaded disease caused by a lack of vitamin C, would begin to set in within weeks or months. Your gums would bleed, your teeth would loosen and fall out, old wounds would reopen, and your limbs would ache with an unbearable pain. Death by scurvy was a slow, agonizing descent, a common end for countless sailors. Even the smallest cut could fester into a deadly infection in the absence of any medical knowledge or sterile conditions. The very act of eating and drinking was a constant battle against decay and disease. This was your daily bread, your sustenance for a journey into the unknown that might never end. The rolling of the ship becomes a constant companion, a ceaseless, dizzying motion that quickly brings on the most debilitating seasickness. You vomit repeatedly, your stomach churning, your body racked with spasms. There is no escape. The deck heaves, the cabin sways, and the world outside the porthole, if you even have one, is an endless expanse of gray, frothing waves. This isn't the gentle rocking of a small boat on a calm lake. This is the relentless, violent pitching of a fragile vessel on an untamed ocean. Sleep, when it comes, is fitful and shallow, punctuated by the creaking of timbers, the howling of the wind, and the crashing of waves against the hull. You are never truly at rest, your body constantly fighting against the forces of the sea. This physical torment is compounded by the mental anguish of knowing you are utterly isolated, thousands of miles from land, with no rescue possible. The vastness of the ocean, once a symbol of opportunity, now feels like a prison without walls. And then there are the storms, not just a squall, but the terrifying fury of the open ocean. The sky turns a bruised purple, the wind howls like a banshee, tearing at the sails and rigging. The ship is tossed about like a toy, rising high on monstrous waves only to plunge into the troughs between them, the bow dipping so low it feels as though you will be swallowed whole by the churning abyss. Rain lashes down in sheets, visibility drops to zero, and the deck becomes a treacherous, slippery death trap. Men are swept overboard, never to be seen again. Masts snap, sails rip to shreds, and the very structure of the ship groans under the strain, threatening to splinter into 1,000 pieces. You are ordered to man the pumps, working frantically in the dark, icy water rising around your ankles, desperately trying to keep the ship afloat. The fear is palpable, a cold, suffocating blanket that settles over everyone. You watch your comrades, their faces pale and drawn, as they too battle against the overwhelming might of nature. In these moments, any illusions of glory or riches are stripped away, leaving only the raw, primal urge to survive. This is not a grand adventure. This is a fight for every breath, every fleeting moment of existence. The constant damp, the lack of fresh air, and the close quarters create a breeding ground for disease. Aside from scurvy, typhus, dysentery, and smallpox could sweep through the crew like wildfire. One man falls ill, then 2, then 10. Without knowledge of hygiene or medicine, there is little to stop the spread. The ship becomes a floating hospital, or rather, a floating morgue. The sick are quarantined in makeshift beds, often without proper care or comfort. Feverish men rave in their sleep, their bodies racked with pain. The dead are sewn into canvas shrouds, often with a final weight attached, and committed to the deep, their silent splash barely noticed amidst the roar of the waves. Their belongings, if they had any of value, are quickly parceled out. The living must continue, their faces grim, knowing that they too could be next. The sheer attrition rate on these voyages was staggering. It wasn't uncommon for half, or even more, of a crew to perish before ever reaching their destination. The journey itself was a culling, a relentless test of endurance against overwhelming odds. This daily confrontation with death was a core component of the age of exploration, a grim statistic buried beneath the tales of discovery. Even beyond disease and storm, boredom and despair were constant enemies. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, an endless cycle of watch duty, meager meals, and the unchanging horizon. The vast emptiness of the ocean, beautiful in its immensity, could also be soul-crushingly monotonous. Some men would descend into madness, driven insane by the isolation and the constant struggle. They might hallucinate, speak to unseen figures, or attempt to throw themselves overboard, seeking an end to the torment. Others would simply waste away, their will to live extinguished by the endless suffering. Gambling and drinking, when supplies allowed, offered fleeting escapes, but often led to more fights and despair. There were no books, no entertainment, no diversions beyond the grim realities of ship life. The mind, starved of stimulation and subjected to constant stress, would begin to turn inward, often with devastating consequences. The psychological toll of these voyages was immense, a silent killer that claimed its victims just as surely as scurvy or a gale. The silence, broken only by the creaking of wood and the roar of the sea, could be deafening. And finally, the navigation itself, a precarious art based on imprecise instruments and the vast, often inaccurate knowledge of the time. There was no GPS, no satellite imagery. Sailors relied on the position of the sun at noon, the stars at night, and rough calculations of speed and direction. A cloudy day could mean a lost fix, a subtle current could throw them miles off course. Charts were rudimentary, often based on guesswork and rumor. Entire continents were drawn with speculative coastlines, vast swathes of ocean marked simply as unknown. Every voyage was a journey into a literal blank space on the map. The fear of sailing off the edge of the world was, perhaps, irrational, but the fear of simply being lost, utterly and completely, was very real. Landfall was not a certainty, but a desperate hope, often preceded by weeks of anxious scanning of the horizon, looking for any sign, any indication, that the endless blue might finally give way to green. The relief of spotting land, any land, after months at sea, would have been an overwhelming surge of emotion, a reprieve from the constant terror of the unknown. But even then, new dangers awaited. Imagine the cry from the crow's nest, "Land ho!" A collective cheer erupts from the weary crew, a surge of relief so profound it almost erases the months of suffering. But this is not the end of your ordeal. It is merely the beginning of a new, perhaps even more perilous chapter. The land that rises before you is not the familiar shores of Europe, but something alien, unknown. Lush, verdant coastlines, perhaps, or stark, rocky outcrops, teeming with unfamiliar flora and fauna. The air, thick with the scent of exotic vegetation, might carry with it the distant sounds of strange birdsong or the unsettling silence of the unpeopled wilderness. This is the New World, a term that belies its ancient history and the people who have called it home for millennia. For you, it is simply the unknown, a land filled with promise and, more immediately, with potential threats. Your arrival is not a gentle one. The ship anchors offshore, the shallow waters often preventing a close approach. You are now faced with the prospect of going ashore in small, open boats, rowed by exhausted men, carrying whatever meager supplies and weaponry the ship possesses. The landing itself can be treacherous, the surf pounding against the shore, threatening to capsize your small craft or smash it against hidden rocks. You wade through the shallows, the sand or mud sucking at your boots, the unfamiliar heat or humidity pressing down upon you. The air is alive with insects you have never seen before, their bites often carrying their own unseen dangers. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every shadow in the trees, could conceal hostile eyes. You are an intruder in a land that is not yours, and the inhabitants may not welcome your arrival. First contact could range from wary curiosity to outright aggression. Imagine encountering people whose language, dress, and customs are utterly foreign to you. Communication is reduced to gestures, to pointing, to hopeful smiles that may be met with suspicion or fear. The cultural misunderstandings are immediate and profound. What you consider a polite gesture might be seen as an insult. Your attempts at trade might be interpreted as theft. The power dynamic is immediately skewed. You and your fellow Europeans possess superior weaponry, steel swords, firearms, but you are also vastly outnumbered and unfamiliar with the terrain. Every interaction is fraught with the potential for violence. A misunderstanding over a trinket, a perceived slight, could erupt into a skirmish, with deadly consequences for both sides. The indigenous peoples you encounter are not the naive savages often depicted in later accounts. They are complex societies with their own laws, traditions, and ways of life, perfectly adapted to their environment. They may be curious about your strange ship and your even stranger appearance, but they are also likely to be wary of your intentions. They have their own histories of conflict and alliance, their own understanding of power and territory. Your arrival disrupts this delicate balance, and they will react in ways that seem unpredictable and often hostile to you. Imagine trying to navigate a complex social landscape without a map, without a shared language, and with the constant threat of violence hanging in the air. The search for resources, gold, spices, land, quickly becomes the driving force behind your presence. These resources are often guarded, either physically or spiritually, by the indigenous inhabitants. Your attempts to extract them may be met with resistance, ranging from passive obstruction to organized attacks. You are no longer just an explorer. You are an invader, and you will be treated as such. Every foray into the interior, every attempt to claim land or seize treasure, is a potential battle. The dense jungles, the rugged mountains, the vast plains, these are not romantic landscapes for you to admire, but hostile environments filled with unseen enemies who know the land far better than you ever will. And then there is the matter of disease. You and your fellow Europeans carry with you a host of illnesses to which the indigenous populations have no immunity. Smallpox, measles, influenza, these seemingly common ailments can decimate entire communities. The effects are catastrophic, far more devastating than any armed conflict. Villages are emptied, populations collapse, and the social fabric of entire cultures unravels. You may not even realize you are the carrier of these deadly plagues, but their impact will be immediate and devastating. The weakened and demoralized survivors may be even more hostile, blaming you for the sickness that has ravaged their families and their way of life. The exchange is rarely equal. While you might succumb to new diseases of the Americas, the impact of European diseases on the native populations was a demographic catastrophe of unprecedented scale. The climate itself is a constant adversary. The relentless heat and humidity of the tropics can quickly sap your strength, leaving you vulnerable to exhaustion and dehydration. Unfamiliar insects bite and sting, sometimes transmitting debilitating diseases like malaria or yellow fever. The rainy seasons bring torrential downpours that can flood rivers, turn trails into impassable mud, and leave you shivering and soaked for days on end. You are ill-equipped to deal with these extremes. Your European clothing is heavy and unsuitable for the heat. You lack the knowledge of local plants and animals that could provide food or medicine. Every day is a struggle against an environment that seems determined to kill you. Wildlife presents another set of dangers. Imagine encountering creatures you have only heard of in fantastical tales: jaguars, crocodiles, venomous snakes, spiders the size of your hand. These are not mythical beasts. They are real predators, perfectly adapted to their environment, and they see you as an easy target. A careless step, a moment of inattention, could result in a deadly bite or a fatal mauling. Even seemingly innocuous creatures like mosquitoes can carry deadly diseases. You are a stranger in a strange land, and the natural world around you is full of unseen threats. Food and water remain a constant preoccupation. The familiar staples of your European diet are unavailable. You must rely on unfamiliar foods, some of which may be poisonous. Hunting and foraging require skills you likely do not possess. Clean drinking water is often scarce, and drinking from contaminated sources can lead to debilitating illnesses. Hunger and thirst gnaw at you constantly, weakening your body and your resolve. Every meal is a gamble, every drink a potential source of sickness. Survival depends on a knowledge of the land and its resources that you simply do not have. Conflict with other European powers is also a constant threat. The age of exploration was also an age of intense rivalry between nations. Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, and Dutch explorers and conquistadors were all vying for territory and resources. Encountering a rival European ship or settlement could lead to armed conflict, even if your own expedition was not explicitly military in nature. You might find yourself caught in the crossfire of imperial ambitions, forced to fight against men who share your language and your faith, but who serve a different crown. The vastness of the oceans did not preclude encounters. It merely made them more unpredictable and potentially more deadly. And finally, there is the constant threat of your own crew. Months at sea, coupled with the hardships of exploration and the lure of potential riches, could breed discontent and mutiny. The captain's authority, often absolute, could be challenged by desperate men. A successful mutiny could mean a change in leadership, but it could also descend into chaos and violence, leaving you at the mercy of men even more ruthless than your former commander. Even without outright mutiny, internal conflicts over resources, rank, or simply personal animosities could erupt into deadly fights. You are surrounded by men who are just as desperate and just as likely to turn on you if their own survival is at stake. Trust is a rare commodity in this brutal new world. Having survived the initial landing and perhaps even a cautious first contact, your next ordeal begins with the relentless pursuit of wealth. The driving force behind many of these expeditions was not scientific curiosity or the noble pursuit of knowledge, but the insatiable desire for gold, silver, and other precious commodities. You, as a common sailor or soldier, are merely a cog in this vast, brutal machine of extraction. Your daily life shifts from surviving the ocean to surviving the merciless demands of your superiors, and the equally merciless resistance of the indigenous peoples whose lands you are now attempting to exploit. The search for riches would lead you into the heart of unfamiliar territories, facing dangers far greater than anything encountered at sea. Your role might involve forced labor. Imagine being tasked with mining for gold or silver deep within the earth under conditions that would defy modern comprehension. The air is thick with dust, the light is dim, and the heat is stifling. You swing a pickaxe for hours on end, your muscles aching, your lungs burning with little to no respite. The tunnels are unstable, threatening to collapse at any moment. Accidents are common. Rock falls, suffocation, falls into deep shafts. There is no safety equipment, no medical aid beyond rudimentary first aid. You work alongside indigenous people, often enslaved or coerced, who are suffering even worse fates, dying in droves from exhaustion and disease. Your own life is considered cheap, but theirs is considered worthless. If mining isn't your lot, perhaps you are part of an exploratory party, venturing into the dense jungle or across arid plains. Every step is fraught with peril. The terrain is unforgiving, the paths non-existent. You hack your way through tangled undergrowth, constantly battling biting insects, venomous snakes, and the debilitating effects of the climate. Supplies dwindle rapidly, and you are always on the verge of starvation and thirst. The sun beats down mercilessly, or torrential rains turn the ground into a quagmire. You are constantly on guard, knowing that every rustle in the bushes could mean a hidden enemy, every shadowed alcove a potential ambush. The vastness of the wilderness is oppressive, a silent, watchful presence that seems to mock your every struggle. The encounters with indigenous populations become increasingly hostile. The initial curiosity or cautious diplomacy quickly gives way to conflict as your intentions to seize their land and resources become clear. You are no longer just exploring, you are conquering. Pitched battles erupt, often against overwhelming numbers. While your firearms offer a technological advantage, they are slow to reload, prone to misfire, and your opponents often possess superior knowledge of the terrain and guerrilla tactics. You face spears, arrows, and clubs wielded by warriors fighting to defend their homes and families. The fighting is brutal, personal, and terrifyingly close quarters. There is no quarter given, no mercy expected. Death can come swiftly from an arrow in the chest, or slowly from a poisoned wound. Beyond direct conflict, the tactics of conquest often involve calculated cruelty. Imagine witnessing or participating in acts of violence designed to instill terror and break the will of the local populations. Villages are burned, crops destroyed, and people taken captive. The psychological warfare is as potent as the physical. You might see leaders tortured or communities forced into impossible labor. The moral lines blur, then disappear entirely. The desperation for riches and the inherent racism of the era justify unimaginable atrocities in the minds of your superiors. You are part of this machine, either as an active participant or a silent bystander, and the horrors you witness will haunt your waking hours and perhaps even your restless sleep. The European diseases continue their silent, devastating work. Even if you avoid direct conflict, the unseen enemy of contagion is always present. You might enter villages that are eerily silent, their inhabitants having succumbed to smallpox before you even arrived. The air itself seems to hang heavy with the scent of death and decay. This demographic collapse, while benefiting the invaders by weakening resistance, also eliminates the very labor force needed for extraction. It's a grim, self-defeating cycle, but one driven by an ignorant and ruthless pursuit of wealth. The sheer scale of death is incomprehensible, transforming vibrant societies into desolate landscapes of grief and despair. Maintaining discipline among your own ranks becomes another severe challenge. The promise of gold is a powerful motivator, but also a corrosive one. As hardships mount and riches fail to materialize immediately, desperation sets in. Greed can turn men against each other faster than any external enemy. Arguments over plunder, accusations of hoarding, and resentment over perceived injustices can erupt into deadly feuds within the European ranks. Mutinies are always a possibility, not just against the captain, but against the expedition leader if the quest for gold seems fruitless. Your own life could be forfeit not just to an arrow, but to a dagger in the dark from a desperate comrade. The environment continues its relentless assault. The strange foods and lack of fresh water lead to chronic stomach ailments, dysentery, and other digestive horrors. Your body is constantly racked with cramps, vomiting, and diarrhea, leaving you weak and dehydrated. There is no escape from these internal battles. Fevers are common, perhaps from malaria, dengue, or other tropical diseases unknown to European medicine. Your skin is covered in rashes, insect bites, and festering sores from minor injuries that never heal properly. You are a walking testament to the sheer physical toll of existing in such a hostile, foreign environment without the proper knowledge or adaptation. Your movements are dictated by rumors and desperation. Tales of mythical cities of gold, like El Dorado, or mountains of silver drive expeditions further and further into the unknown, leading you on torturous marches through impassable terrain. You follow dubious maps, listen to unreliable guides, and push your body to its absolute limits in pursuit of a phantom. These wild goose chases consume vast amounts of time, resources, and lives, often ending in disillusionment, starvation, and the bitter knowledge that you have risked everything for nothing. The psychological impact of such futile endeavors is devastating, eroding any lingering hope or morale. The ever-present threat of being abandoned or left behind. If you fall ill or are too weak to continue, you could easily be left to die in the wilderness, a burden to the expedition. There is no compassion, only cold calculation of utility. Your comrades, hardened by their own suffering, might barely spare a glance as they march past your prostrate form. The knowledge that you are utterly expendable, that your life means so little, is a chilling reality of this era. Your only value is your ability to contribute to the expedition's goals, and once that is gone, so are your chances of survival. And finally, there is the constant threat of your own crew. Months at sea, coupled with the hardships of exploration and the lure of potential riches, could breed discontent and mutiny. The captain's authority, often absolute, could be challenged by desperate men. A successful mutiny could mean a change in leadership, but it could also descend into chaos and violence, leaving you at the mercy of men even more ruthless than your former commander. Even without outright mutiny, internal conflicts over resources, rank, or simply personal animosities could erupt into deadly fights. You are surrounded by men who are just as desperate and just as likely to turn on you if their own survival is at stake. Trust is a rare commodity in this brutal new world. Even if you manage to survive the initial landfalls, the brutal conquests, and the ravages of disease on the newly discovered continents, your ordeal was far from over. The journey back across the vast, indifferent ocean presented a new set of challenges, arguably more terrifying because of their relentless monotony and the utter isolation they imposed. You might have seen the new world, plundered some of its riches, or simply survived its horrors, but now you face the agonizing prospect of returning home, a journey that could take months, sometimes even years, and was fraught with dangers just as profound as those encountered on the outward-bound leg. Your life, once again, was wholly at the mercy of the elements and the primitive art of navigation. Navigation in the age of exploration was less a precise science and more a perilous gamble. Forget the comforting certainty of modern GPS. Your primary tools were a magnetic compass, often unreliable due to variations in the Earth's magnetic field, and an astrolabe or quadrant to measure the altitude of the sun or pole star. These instruments were rudimentary, their readings easily affected by the rolling of the ship, the pitching of the deck, and the ever-present spray. Calculating longitude, your east-west position, was notoriously difficult, relying on accurate timekeeping, a technology still in its infancy. Even small errors could accumulate over weeks, leading you hundreds, even thousands of miles off course. Imagine the anxiety of peering at a vast, unchanging horizon day after day, knowing that a tiny miscalculation could lead to your ship simply vanishing into the endless expanse, never to be seen again. The reliance on dead reckoning was absolute. This involved estimating your position based on the last known point, the ship's speed, and its direction. Speed was measured by tossing a log attached to a knotted rope into the water and counting how many knots ran out in a given time, hence the term knots for speed at sea. Direction was taken from the compass, but currents, winds, and human error could dramatically skew these calculations. You might think you were sailing east, only to find yourself gradually, imperceptibly, drifting north or south. Days could pass, then weeks, with no land in sight and the growing dread that you were completely lost, an insignificant speck adrift in an immeasurable void. The psychological toll of this uncertainty, this constant state of being adrift, was immense, often leading to despair and even madness among the crew. Water, the most vital of all provisions, was a constant source of anxiety. Stored in wooden casks, it quickly became stagnant, warm, and often green with algae. Insects would breed in it, and sometimes even rats or other vermin would drown in the supply. Drinking it was a daily act of defiance against your gag reflex, knowing that every gulp could introduce disease into your system. Supplies were always finite, and strict rationing was enforced. Imagine going days with only a cup of this foul liquid, your throat parched, your lips cracked, your body aching with dehydration. The desire for fresh water, for even a single sip of cool, clean liquid, would become an obsessive torment, dominating your every thought. The thought of running out entirely, of dying of thirst under the merciless sun, was a constant, terrifying shadow. Food on the return journey was even more dismal than on the outward voyage. What little fresh food was taken aboard would have long since spoiled. Your diet would revert to the dreaded hardtack, often moldy, worm-eaten, and so hard it could chip a tooth. Salted meat, by now, would be rancid, crawling with maggots and barely recognizable. Hunger became a constant companion, a gnawing ache in your stomach that never truly subsided. Malnutrition was rampant, leaving men weak, susceptible to illness, and utterly devoid of energy. The sight of a rat, though repulsive, might even stir a primal hunger, hinting at the desperate measures some might take to survive. Scurvy, the silent killer, would inevitably reappear, if it hadn't already claimed its victims. Weeks or months without fresh fruits or vegetables meant that your body's reserves of vitamin C would be completely depleted. Gums would swell and bleed, teeth would loosen and fall out, old wounds would reopen and refuse to heal, and dark, spreading bruises would appear on your skin. Your limbs would become agonizingly painful, making every movement an agony. As the disease progressed, you would become lethargic, weak, and utterly helpless. Death from scurvy was a slow, agonizing process, a grim inevitability for a significant portion of any long-distance crew. There was no cure known at the time, only the desperate hope that land would be sighted before the disease claimed you. Storms at sea, as we've discussed, were terrifying on the way out, but they were even more so on the way back. Your ship, battered and weakened by months of travel, was less resilient. Its timbers might be warped, its sails patched, its rigging frayed. A powerful gale could shatter the mast, tear holes in the hull, or simply swamp the vessel, sending it to the bottom of the ocean with all hands lost. You would be tossed about like a cork on the monstrous waves, fighting for your life against the overwhelming might of the storm, knowing that your ship, your only sanctuary, was slowly, agonizingly being torn apart around you. The sound of the wind screaming through the rigging, the crashing of waves over the deck, and the groaning of the ship's timbers would fill your every waking moment with fear. The constant dampness and the lack of hygiene continued to foster disease. Fevers, dysentery, and other infections would sweep through the weakened crew. The sick were often left to suffer, their cries mingling with the sounds of the ship. There was no medicine, no understanding of germ theory. The ship's surgeon, if one was even present, would likely rely on bleeding, purges, or amputations, treatments that often did more harm than good. The dead would be consigned to the deep, a regular occurrence, their brief service ended by the unforgiving sea. The dwindling numbers of the crew would mean longer shifts for the survivors, pushing their already exhausted bodies to the breaking point, creating a grim cycle of work, exhaustion, and illness. The psychological toll of the return journey was immense. The thrill of discovery, if it ever existed, was long gone, replaced by an overwhelming longing for home and the crushing certainty that you might never see it again. The endless expanse of the ocean, the unchanging horizon, the constant, monotonous creaking of the ship, all combined to create a profound sense of isolation and despair. Some men would lose their minds, driven insane by the solitude and suffering. They might become violent or simply withdraw into themselves, staring blankly at the waves. The hope that had sustained them on the outward voyage would slowly erode, replaced by a bleak acceptance of their fate. The camaraderie that developed early on might be replaced by resentment and suspicion, as men fought over dwindling resources or simply the last vestiges of their sanity. The risk of encountering pirates or rival European ships was also a very real threat. A ship laden with even meager treasures was a tempting target for opportunistic buccaneers, or for the privateers and naval vessels of enemy nations. A chance encounter could lead to a sudden, brutal naval battle, with cannon fire tearing through the wooden hull, splinters flying and men falling dead or grievously wounded. Even if you survived the initial engagement, capture could mean enslavement, imprisonment, or a summary execution. You had escaped the dangers of the land, only to face the man-made dangers of the sea, often just as ruthless and unforgiving. Your dreams of home could be shattered in an instant by a black flag on the horizon. Finally, the return home, if it happened at all, was not a glorious homecoming for many. You might arrive back a shadow of your former self, emaciated, scarred, and perhaps mentally broken by the ordeal. The wealth you sought might be non-existent or quickly squandered. Your family might be gone or have moved on, assuming you were lost to the sea. The world you left might have changed in your absence, leaving you feeling like a stranger in your own land. The stories you carried, of unimaginable hardships and horrors, would be met with skepticism or disbelief by those who had never left the safety of the shore. The age of exploration was not just about discovering new lands. It was about destroying lives, forging unbreakable spirits, and forever altering the fabric of the known world, often at an unbearable human cost. Even when the ship was not battling a storm or navigating uncharted waters, the daily existence below deck was a form of slow, agonizing torment, transforming the vessel from a means of transport into a veritable floating prison. The realities of life in these cramped, unhygienic, and perpetually dark spaces would swiftly crush any romantic notions of seafaring adventure. Your survival would hinge not just on physical resilience, but on a grim acceptance of an existence defined by filth, disease, and the constant presence of your suffering comrades. This was the inescapable reality of the age, a stark contrast to the grand maps being drawn on the deck above. The air quality, or rather the lack thereof, was an immediate assault on your senses. Below deck, especially in the lowest holds where many sailors slept and much of the cargo was stored, ventilation was virtually non-existent. The air was heavy, thick with the combined odors of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, vomit, human waste, rotting provisions, and the stagnant, putrid bilge water that sloshed endlessly beneath the floorboards. Imagine breathing this noxious mixture day in and day out, your lungs constantly struggling against the oppressive stench. The atmosphere was so foul that it alone could induce nausea, contributing to the persistent seasickness that plagued many throughout the voyage. The very act of drawing a breath was a reminder of your confinement. Personal hygiene was a concept largely unknown and practically impossible to maintain. Fresh water was too precious to be wasted on washing. You would likely go for weeks, if not months, without a proper bath. Your clothes, whatever meager rags you possessed, would become stiff with salt, sweat, and grime, clinging to your body. Imagine the incessant itching from accumulated dirt, from lice, and from other parasitic insects that thrived in such conditions. Skin rashes, boils, and festering sores were common, exacerbated by the constant chafing of rough clothing and the lack of cleanliness. The absence of proper sanitation facilities meant that waste was often collected in buckets or simply discharged directly into the bilge, adding to the pervasive stench and providing a breeding ground for diseases. Your body would slowly, inevitably, become a walking testament to the horrors of neglect and filth. The constant dampness permeated everything. Even in fair weather, the ship was never truly dry. Seawater splashed over the decks during rough seas, leaked through seams in the hull, and condensed on the cold interior surfaces. Your sleeping area, if it could be called that, would be perpetually clammy, your clothes and bedding perpetually damp. This constant moisture, combined with the lack of sunlight and fresh air, created ideal conditions for mold and mildew to grow everywhere, further contributing to the foul odors and respiratory ailments. The dampness seeped into your bones, leaving you with a persistent chill and an aching discomfort that no amount of exertion could shake off. Rats and other vermin were an ever-present menace. These ships were infested with them, scurrying through the holds, gnawing at ropes, provisions, and even the ship's timbers. They were carriers of disease, particularly the fleas that carried typhus, which could decimate a crew far faster than any storm or enemy. Imagine the unnerving sensation of rats crawling over you in the dark as you tried to sleep, or finding them in your meager rations. They were a constant, unsettling reminder of the filth and decay that surrounded you, and a direct threat to your health and the integrity of your supplies. The battle against them was constant but ultimately futile, a grim part of daily life. Sleep was a luxury, rarely achieved. Your designated sleeping space would be a narrow, shared bunk, if you were lucky, or simply a spot on the floor among your comrades and the cargo. The constant rolling and pitching of the ship made true rest almost impossible. The creaking and groaning of the wooden hull, the crashing of waves, the shouts of men on watch, and the rhythmic thud of the pumps would penetrate any attempt at slumber. Even when physically exhausted, your mind would remain alert, tense, anticipating the next sudden lurch or the alarm of a storm. Deep, restorative sleep was a forgotten sensation, replaced by a perpetual state of fatigue that dulled your senses and eroded your judgment. The absence of natural light was profound. Below deck, illumination came only from dim, flickering oil lamps or candles, if at all, creating a perpetual twilight or absolute darkness. Your eyes would strain to adapt, constantly struggling to discern shapes and obstacles in the gloom. This lack of sunlight contributed to a pervasive sense of disorientation and depression, disrupting natural sleep cycles and exacerbating feelings of confinement. The rare moments you ascended to the upper deck and felt the sun on your face would be a stark, almost painful contrast, a brief reminder of the vibrant world you had left behind and might never fully re-enter. Privacy was a forgotten concept. You lived in constant, inescapable proximity to dozens, sometimes hundreds of other men. Every bodily function, every personal moment was observed or inferred. There was no solitude, no space to retreat and gather your thoughts. This enforced intimacy, coupled with the immense stress and discomfort, inevitably led to frayed nerves and quick tempers. Small annoyances could fester into deep resentments, and minor disagreements could escalate into violent altercations. The lack of personal space was a constant source of psychological torment, eroding individual identity and fostering a sense of perpetual vulnerability. Boredom, paradoxically, was another profound torment. Despite the constant dangers, there were long stretches of monotonous days at sea when little happened. The same faces, the same unchanging routine, the same endless expanse of water. Without books, games, or any form of meaningful diversion, the mind was left to its own devices, often spiraling into dark thoughts of home, despair, or the grim inevitability of death. The tedium was a slow poison, eroding morale and willpower, making the already arduous journey feel even longer and more unbearable. This mental stagnation was as damaging as any physical ailment, leading to apathy and a dangerous loss of vigilance. The smell, it is worth reiterating. The composite aroma of humanity at its most desperate, unwashed bodies, sickness, fear, sweat, grime, and the ever-present stench of the bilge, would be a defining characteristic of your existence below deck. This was not merely an unpleasant odor. It was a visceral, suffocating presence that clung to your clothes, your hair, and permeated your very being. It was the scent of degradation, of suffering, and of a world where basic human dignity was a forgotten luxury. You would carry this scent with you, even if you made it back to shore, a permanent reminder of the squalor you had endured. In essence, life below deck was designed for function, not for human comfort or well-being. It was a space optimized for cargo and crude efficiency, a necessary evil for prolonged voyages. To survive it, you would have to shed every expectation of personal space, cleanliness, and comfort. You would have to accept that your body would become a vessel of filth and disease, and your mind a prisoner of monotony and despair. The ship was not just your transport, it was your torture chamber, and every day spent within its confines was a testament to the extraordinary, almost unbelievable resilience of the human spirit. Even more terrifying than the visible threats of storms, starvation, or hostile encounters was the unseen enemy that stalked every ship in the age of exploration: disease. Long before a ship might encounter a rival nation or a furious squall, its crew would already be under siege from within, their bodies slowly succumbing to illnesses that modern medicine would swiftly conquer. The prevalence of sickness and the horrifying mortality rates were not mere statistics. They were the pervasive, terrifying realities of every single day at sea, transforming voyages of discovery into floating charnel houses. You wouldn't just be risking your life. You would be slowly, agonizingly dying by degrees, your body betraying you piece by piece. Scurvy, as we've touched upon, was the undisputed king of these maritime afflictions, a specter that haunted every long voyage. Imagine the initial subtle signs: a persistent fatigue that no amount of rest could alleviate, a nagging ache in your joints, a general feeling of malaise. Then, the more gruesome symptoms would begin to manifest. Your gums would swell, turn purple, and bleed profusely, making eating an excruciating ordeal. Your teeth would loosen, eventually falling out. Old wounds, perhaps a small cut from a month ago, would suddenly reopen, festering and refusing to heal. Dark, spreading bruises would appear spontaneously on your skin, even without impact, giving you a mottled, ghastly appearance. Your limbs would become agonizingly painful, making movement almost impossible. The disease attacked every tissue in your body, from your internal organs to your skin, slowly and relentlessly consuming you from within. Death from scurvy was a slow, agonizing process of internal decay, a grim testament to the body's inability to function without a vital nutrient. There was no cure known at the time, only the desperate, often futile hope of fresh provisions. But scurvy was far from the only killer. Dysentery, often referred to as the bloody flux, was a common and utterly debilitating affliction. Imagine a constant, uncontrollable urge to empty your bowels, producing watery diarrhea mixed with blood and mucus. This relentless purging would lead to rapid dehydration, extreme weakness, and severe abdominal cramps. The stench below deck would become even more unbearable as men succumbed to this horrific illness, unable to control their bodily functions. Dysentery spread rapidly in the cramped, unsanitary conditions, as contaminated water and unwashed hands ensured its swift transmission throughout the crew. The victim would waste away, their body ravaged by fluid loss, eventually collapsing from exhaustion and organ failure. Typhus, often carried by lice that infested the unwashed bodies and clothing of the sailors, was another merciless killer. The onset would be sudden, a high fever, splitting headaches, muscle aches, and a characteristic rash appearing on the torso. As the fever raged, delirium would set in, the victim babbling incoherently, their eyes glazed and unresponsive. Typhus epidemics could sweep through a ship with terrifying speed, incapacitating and killing dozens in a matter of days. The close quarters meant that if one man contracted it, it was almost guaranteed to spread, turning the ship into a floating fever ward. The lack of understanding about disease transmission meant that desperate attempts to clean or isolate the sick were often too little, too late, and ultimately ineffective. Beyond these major killers, a host of other maladies plagued the crews. Simple fevers could escalate into deadly pneumonia in the absence of antibiotics. Infected cuts and abrasions, common given the arduous nature of the work, could lead to gangrene, often necessitating crude amputations performed by the ship's surgeon, if one was even present, with no anesthesia and a high chance of fatal infection. Eye infections, boils, ulcers, and debilitating skin conditions were rampant. Even minor illnesses could become life-threatening when combined with malnutrition, dehydration, and the constant stress on the body. Your immune system, already weakened by the harsh conditions, offered little defense against these relentless assaults. The ship's surgeon, if you were fortunate enough to have one, was rarely a trained physician by modern standards. More often, they were barbers or laymen with some practical experience in setting bones, pulling teeth, and performing basic, often brutal, operations. Their understanding of anatomy and disease was rudimentary at best, based on ancient theories like the four humors. Treatments often involved bleeding, purging, or administering dubious concoctions that were more likely to harm than heal. Amputations, performed with unsterilized saws and knives, were excruciating and frequently resulted in fatal infections. Pain relief was non-existent beyond opium or copious amounts of alcohol, if available. The cure could often be worse than the disease, turning the surgeon's corner of the ship into a chamber of horrors. The psychological impact of living amidst constant sickness and death was profound. Every cough, every fever, every complaint of pain would spark a fresh wave of fear. You would watch your comrades sicken and die around you, their bodies often thrown unceremoniously overboard. The dwindling numbers of the crew would mean that the remaining men had to work even harder, pushing their exhausted bodies beyond their limits, creating a grim cycle of work, exhaustion, and illness. Grief was a luxury few could afford. The dead were simply replaced by the next man in line for their duties. The sheer attrition rate on these voyages was staggering, sometimes claiming over half the crew, or even more, before reaching their destination. The final indignity for the sick and dying was the lack of comfort or compassion. In the cramped, dark, and often violently pitching confines below deck, there was little space or time for nursing the ill. They would often be left in their own filth, isolated not out of medical understanding, but out of fear of contagion or simply lack of resources. Their moans and cries would become part of the ship's dreadful soundtrack, a constant reminder of their own precarious mortality. Death was a frequent visitor, its presence normalized, a grim part of the daily routine. The dead were simply sewn into canvas, weighted and consigned to the deep, their identities dissolving into the vast indifference of the ocean. In short, your body, already weakened by malnutrition and exhaustion, would become a battleground for countless microbial invaders. You would live in constant dread of symptoms, knowing that a simple cough or a mild fever could be the harbinger of a swift and agonizing end. The age of exploration was not just a journey into uncharted waters. It was a journey into the terrifying heart of human vulnerability, a stark reminder of how fragile life was in the face of microscopic, unseen enemies, and how little control humans had over their own destinies when confronted by the relentless tide of disease. Beyond the natural perils and the invisible scourges of disease, the most immediate and often most terrifying threat to your daily survival on an age of exploration vessel came from within your own floating society: the captain. On board his ship, the captain was not merely a leader. He was an absolute monarch, his word law, his power unquestioned, and his justice swift and often brutal. In an environment where survival hinged on rigid order and unquestioning obedience, discipline was maintained through fear, and any transgression, real or perceived, could be met with savage retribution. You wouldn't just be fighting the elements. You'd be fighting to stay in line, to avoid the captain's wrath, and to preserve your very skin from the cruel hand of maritime law. The concept of a fair trial was non-existent. The captain was prosecutor, judge, jury, and executioner all rolled into one. Any perceived insubordination, laziness, theft, or defiance could be punished on the spot. The smallest infraction could lead to a severe lashing, a public humiliation designed to break your spirit and serve as a chilling warning to others. There was no appeal, no higher authority to petition in the middle of the ocean. Your life, your limbs, and your well-being were entirely at the discretion of one man, whose sanity and temperament might already be fraying under the immense pressures of command. A bad mood, a moment of frustration, could mean a disproportionate punishment for a minor offense. Flogging was perhaps the most common and feared form of punishment. Imagine being stripped to the waist, your back exposed to the merciless sun or the cold spray, tied to a grating or a mast. The whip, often a cat o' nine tails with multiple knotted cords, would descend with a terrifying whistle, tearing strips of flesh from your back. Each lash would be accompanied by a searing pain that would momentarily eclipse all other sensations, followed by the burning agony of raw, open wounds. The number of lashes could range from a dozen to hundreds, enough to incapacitate a man for weeks or even kill him outright. The blood would run down your back, a public spectacle designed to instill terror and deter future transgressions. Even if you survived the flogging itself, the open wounds would quickly fester in the unhygienic conditions below deck, often leading to deadly infections. Beyond physical beatings, other forms of punishment were equally dehumanizing. You might be forced to run the gauntlet, where your fellow crewmen, armed with knotted ropes or sticks, would strike you as you ran between two lines of men. This not only inflicted pain but also forced your comrades to participate in your punishment, eroding any sense of solidarity. You could be keel-hauled, a horrifying punishment where you were dragged under the ship from one side to the other, often drowning or being scraped to death by barnacles on the hull. While this was less common by the 16th century, the fear of it lingered. More typically, you might be put in irons, confined to a dark, cramped space below deck, left to starve or thirst, your body cramping from immobility. The threat of starvation was another powerful tool of control. Food and water rations were strictly controlled by the captain or his officers. Any act of defiance could result in your rations being cut, a terrifying prospect on a journey where hunger was already a constant companion. Imagine watching your comrades eat their meager portions while your stomach growls with emptiness, knowing that your only relief lies in complete submission. This form of punishment exploited the most basic human needs, turning hunger into a weapon against insubordination, slowly starving a man into compliance or death. Mutiny, the ultimate act of defiance, was met with the ultimate penalty: death. If a crew dared to rise against their captain and failed, the consequences were swift and brutal. Hanging from the yardarm was the preferred method of execution at sea, a public display meant to strike terror into the hearts of any who harbored rebellious thoughts. Imagine watching a comrade, perhaps a friend, swung aloft, his struggles visible against the vast sky, his body left to dangle as a gruesome warning. The fear of mutiny and the knowledge of its dire consequences was a constant undercurrent in the ship's brutal hierarchy. It was a terrifying gamble, often born of desperation, with the highest possible stakes. The psychological warfare was just as potent as the physical. The constant threat of arbitrary punishment, the knowledge that your fate rested entirely on the whim of another, created an atmosphere of pervasive fear and anxiety. You would learn to anticipate the captain's moods, to avoid his gaze, and to perform your duties with meticulous diligence, simply to avoid drawing his attention. Every raised voice, every sharp command would send a jolt of fear through your body. This constant state of vigilance, this suppression of your own will, chipped away at your dignity and your sense of self, reducing you to little more than a tool in the hands of power. The officers, too, were part of this chain of command, often empowered to inflict their own forms of discipline, though typically less severe than the captains. The boatswain, the sailing master, or the first mate could all deliver blows, verbal abuse, or minor punishments. This created a multi-layered system of fear and control, where every superior held power over you. There was no escaping the hierarchy, no place to hide from the constant scrutiny and the ever-present threat of violence. Your life was not your own. It belonged to the ship and its masters. Even seemingly minor offenses could be punished with disproportionate severity. Sleeping on watch, losing a piece of equipment, or even a clumsy mistake could result in a brutal lashing or being put in chains for days. The rationale was simple. In the harsh, unforgiving environment of the open sea, even small errors could have catastrophic consequences for the entire ship and its mission. Therefore, every man had to perform his duty flawlessly, and failure was not an option, regardless of exhaustion, sickness, or inexperience. This unyielding demand for perfection created an atmosphere of constant tension and anxiety amongst the crew. The lack of any legal recourse meant that you were utterly powerless. There were no courts to appeal to, no rights to protect you. Once you stepped onto that ship, you surrendered all autonomy. Your only hope for justice, if such a concept even existed, lay in the unlikely event of a future investigation by Admiralty courts, long after the voyage had ended and memories had faded. In the moment, you were alone, exposed, and utterly vulnerable to the will of your superiors. Your only viable strategy was complete and total subservience, hoping to avoid attention and silently endure until the journey's end, if it ever came. Ultimately, surviving a day in the age of exploration meant not only enduring the physical hardships of the sea and land, but also navigating the treacherous waters of human power and cruelty. It meant accepting a life where dignity was a luxury, fear a constant companion, and your very existence hinged on the whim of a single man. The captain's absolute rule was a grim reflection of the ruthless necessity of command in an era when control over a desperate and often unruly crew was paramount for the survival of the expedition itself. It was a constant, tangible threat, ever present, making every moment of your journey a balance between obedience and the risk of brutal retribution. In an age where science was still in its infancy, and the natural world remained largely unexplained, the deep anxieties and profound unknowns of maritime life in the age of exploration gave fertile ground to a pervasive culture of superstition. For the common sailor, every creak of the timbers, every shift in the wind, every glimpse of an unfamiliar creature in the water could be interpreted as an omen, a sign from a higher power, or the mischievous work of malevolent spirits. Your survival would not only depend on navigating tangible dangers, but also on appeasing the unseen forces believed to govern the fate of every voyage, and on battling the insidious psychological toll of these beliefs. This wasn't just a physical journey, it was a constant, unsettling dance with the ethereal, a terrifying exploration of the human mind under extreme duress. Imagine the pervasive fear of bad omens. A rat leaving a sinking ship was a clear sign of impending doom, but even less obvious events could trigger widespread panic. A bird landing on the mast might be seen as a lost soul or a harbinger of ill luck. A sailor whistling in a calm sea was strictly forbidden, believed to summon high winds and storms. Spill salt, prepare for misfortune. Lose a hat overboard, a sure sign that the voyage would never end well. These weren't quaint old wives' tales. They were deeply held convictions that shaped behavior and fueled paranoia. Every unusual event, every unexpected sound, could be interpreted through the lens of impending disaster, creating an atmosphere of constant tension and anxiety amongst the crew. Sailors lived in constant dread of encounters with mythical creatures of the deep. The vast, unexplored oceans were thought to be teeming with leviathans, colossal sea serpents capable of crushing a ship in their coils, or monstrous kraken with tentacles large enough to drag entire vessels to the bottom. Even if you, personally, were a skeptic, the fear of your shipmates was infectious. A sudden lurch, an unexplained tremor, or a shadowy form glimpsed in the dark water could trigger widespread terror, leading to desperate prayers, panicked shouting, or even men refusing to work. The line between reality and legend blurred in the minds of exhausted, superstitious men thousands of miles from shore, making every unknown ripple on the water a source of chilling dread. The supernatural was woven into the fabric of daily life. Ghost stories of drowned sailors, spectral ships, and vengeful spirits were commonplace, whispered in the dim, flickering light below deck. Imagine trying to sleep in a cramped, dark space, surrounded by the creaking timbers and the groaning of the ship, your mind filled with tales of the restless dead haunting the very vessel you were on. Every inexplicable noise, every sudden chill could be attributed to a ghostly presence, further eroding your already fragile sanity. The psychological impact of these beliefs, combined with isolation and fear, could lead to vivid hallucinations or a descent into madness for those already on the edge. Religious faith, while a source of comfort for some, could also be a source of terror for others. Many believed that storms were direct manifestations of God's wrath, a punishment for sins committed. A particularly violent tempest might lead to desperate prayers, promises of repentance, and even attempts to identify and cast out those believed to be sinners or Jonahs responsible for the ship's misfortune. The fear of divine retribution was a powerful motivator, driving men to confess their sins or to enforce a rigid, often hypocritical, morality on their shipmates. The concept of purgatory and eternal damnation loomed large, making the possibility of dying at sea without final rites a terrifying prospect for many. The rituals and charms against bad luck were as varied as the fears they sought to appease. Sailors might carry religious medallions, blessed tokens, or even grotesque talismans for protection. Some believed that nailing a horseshoe to the mast brought good fortune, or that rubbing a particular part of the ship before battle would grant victory. Others would perform elaborate rituals before setting sail, or even sacrifice animals or objects to the sea gods to ensure a safe passage. Adhering to these customs was paramount. To disregard them was to invite disaster, and any man perceived as bringing bad luck could quickly become an outcast, or worse, blamed for the ship's woes and possibly thrown overboard. Dreams and visions took on profound significance. In the endless monotony of the ocean, with little external stimulation, the subconscious mind could play tricks. Vivid dreams, perhaps of home or of impending doom, would be shared and interpreted as prophecies. Exhaustion and malnutrition could also induce hallucinations, causing men to see phantom ships, mythical beasts, or even deceased loved ones in the waves or the clouds. These experiences, taken as undeniable truths, could further fuel the prevailing superstitions and lead to irrational decisions, even by the officers who were supposedly more educated. The line between dream and reality, between sanity and delusion, became dangerously thin. Even the very act of charting a course, or naming a new land, was often imbued with spiritual significance. Crosses were erected upon first landing, territories claimed in the name of God and King. The act of discovery was often framed as a divine mission, a way of spreading Christianity and civilizing the heathen lands. This religious justification, however, often served as a convenient excuse for exploitation and brutality. It allowed men to commit terrible atrocities while believing they were acting on God's will, creating a dangerous psychological dissonance between their faith and their actions. The psychological burden of living with these fears and superstitions was immense. Every unexplained sound, every sudden movement, every change in the weather could trigger a wave of anxiety. The constant vigilance against both real and imagined threats eroded mental well-being, leading to paranoia, depression, and psychological breakdowns. The men were not just battling the ocean. They were battling their own minds, their own deeply ingrained beliefs, and the collective fears of their comrades. This internal struggle was often as debilitating as any physical ailment, leaving them vulnerable and desperate. Ultimately, your experience in the age of exploration would involve not just a physical struggle against nature and hostile forces, but a profound psychological battle against the unknown. The human mind, pushed to its limits by isolation, fear, and suffering, would grasp at any explanation, however irrational, to make sense of its terrifying reality. Superstition was not merely a cultural quirk. It was a coping mechanism, a desperate attempt to impose order on a chaotic and unfathomable world. It provided a framework, however flawed, for understanding, and perhaps even influencing the terrifying forces that dictated whether you would live to see another sunrise or be swallowed by the dark, unknowable depths of the ocean. Even if you somehow managed to evade the captain's brutal discipline, the ravages of disease, and the pervasive psychological torment of superstition, an equally insidious and inescapable enemy stalked every long voyage in the age of exploration: hunger and thirst. The provisioning of ships was a constant logistical nightmare, and the slow, agonizing process of starvation and dehydration was a more common killer than any single storm or battle. Your daily existence would be a continuous, desperate struggle against the gnawing emptiness in your stomach, the parched dryness in your throat, and the creeping realization that your body was slowly, inexorably wasting away. Imagine your daily diet. Forget any concept of fresh food or balanced meals. Your primary sustenance would be hardtack. This was not merely a biscuit. It was a rock-hard, unpalatable slab of flour and water, baked to an extreme dryness to prevent spoilage. It was so hard it could chip a tooth, and often had to be soaked in water if you had any to spare or broth to be even remotely edible. More often than not, it was infested with weevils, small beetles that burrowed through the biscuit. You would either pick them out or, more likely, simply eat them, adding a meager, unwitting protein source to your diet. The taste was bland, monotonous, and utterly devoid of flavor, yet it was the foundation of your survival. Salted meat was your main protein. This was typically pork or beef, preserved in vast quantities of salt to prevent decay. By the time it reached your plate, it would be incredibly tough, often rancid, and so salty it would intensify your thirst. Imagine gnawing on a piece of this leathery, barely edible substance, struggling to tear off a mouthful, knowing that this was all you would get. It was a monotonous diet, week after week, month after month, providing little in the way of essential nutrients, contributing significantly to the onset of scurvy and other deficiency diseases. The smell alone of the brine and the slowly decaying meat was enough to turn a modern stomach. Water was the most precious commodity and often the most contaminated. Stored in large wooden casks in the ship's hold, it quickly became stagnant, warm, and often slimy with algae and mold. Insects would breed in it, and sometimes unfortunate rats would fall in and drown, further contaminating the supply. Imagine the taste and smell of this foul liquid forced down your throat to stave off unbearable thirst. Strict rationing was always in effect, measured out perhaps a cup or two per day, barely enough to sustain you, certainly not enough to feel truly hydrated. The constant craving for fresh, clean water would become an obsession, dominating your every thought, making you keenly aware of the slow, creeping agony of dehydration. As the voyage dragged on, provisions would inevitably spoil or run out entirely. The casks of water would leak, food stores would be decimated by rats, insects, or mold, and what was left would be of increasingly poor quality. Imagine the desperate measures taken when food became truly scarce. Rats, once despised vermin, might become a source of protein. Boots made of leather might be boiled to extract some meager nourishment. The desperation for food could drive men to consume anything vaguely edible, risking poisoning or further illness in their desperate attempts to survive. Discipline would often break down around food, leading to theft, hoarding, and violent disputes among the crew. The constant state of malnutrition had profound effects on your body. You would become emaciated, your muscles wasting away, leaving you weak and barely able to perform your duties. Your skin would become sallow and loose, your eyes sunken. Fatigue would be a constant, overwhelming presence, making every simple task an exhausting ordeal. Your immune system, deprived of vital nutrients, would be severely compromised, leaving you vulnerable to every cough, every fever, every minor infection. A small cut could fester into a deadly wound. A mild cold could turn into fatal pneumonia. The psychological impact of perpetual hunger and thirst was immense. Your thoughts would constantly turn to food, fantasizing about meals you once took for granted. The irritability and short tempers among the crew would intensify, leading to more frequent arguments and violence. Hope would slowly erode, replaced by a grim resignation to your fate. The sight of a fresh fish caught from the ocean might trigger a desperate scramble, only to result in further disappointment if it was too small or lost. The tantalizing proximity of a vast ocean of undrinkable water, while your body screamed for hydration, is a particular form of mental torture. The officers, while generally better fed than the common sailors, were not immune. Their provisions might last longer, but they too would eventually face the same dwindling supplies and deteriorating quality. The shared struggle against hunger, however, did not always foster camaraderie. Sometimes it exacerbated the class divide, leading to resentment and whispers of mutiny if the common crew perceived favoritism or hoarding. The distribution of rations was a constant source of tension, meticulously watched by starving eyes, ready to erupt into protest if perceived as unfair. Even when land was sighted, relief was not immediate. The fresh provisions available upon landing might be unfamiliar or even poisonous if consumed without proper knowledge. Furthermore, many indigenous foods might be difficult for European digestive systems to process, leading to further illness. The recovery from severe malnutrition was slow and arduous, requiring weeks or months of proper nourishment, a luxury rarely afforded during an ongoing expedition. You might have survived the journey, but the scars of starvation would remain, a testament to the brutal daily grind against the most basic human needs. In a grim twist of fate, the very pursuit of wealth often overshadowed the necessity of preserving life. Expeditions would prioritize space for potential treasure or trade goods over sufficient provisions, gambling on quick journeys or the availability of resources at their destination. This gamble frequently cost countless lives, as ships ran out of food and water far from land, their crews perishing slowly and horribly. The allure of gold was a more powerful motivator than the instinct for self-preservation, leading captains to push their crews and their vessels to the absolute brink, often with catastrophic consequences. Ultimately, your experience in the age of exploration would be defined by a constant, inescapable battle against hunger and thirst. It was a prolonged form of torture, slowly eroding your strength, your health, and your very will to live. The romantic tales of discovery often conveniently omit the daily reality of a starving, dehydrated crew, their bodies racked with disease, driven to desperate measures by the simple, brutal need for sustenance. To last a day, let alone months or years, in such an environment meant enduring a continuous, agonizing process of biological decline, a slow descent into a living hell of physical and mental torment. Even if you manage to survive the squalor below deck, the internal battles of disease, the harsh discipline, and the agonizing pangs of starvation, the ultimate, terrifying nightmare of the age of exploration lay in the ever-present threat of shipwreck. The vast, uncharted oceans were littered with hidden reefs, treacherous shoals, and unpredictable currents, transforming any voyage into a constant gamble with a watery grave. Unlike land-based disasters, a shipwreck in the open sea offered no refuge, no escape, and prolonged your agony in ways more horrifying than any swift end. Your survival, if it even came, would involve unimaginable suffering against the indifferent immensity of the ocean. Imagine the sudden, catastrophic impact. Perhaps a massive wave slams into the hull, tearing away planking, or a hidden rock rips a gaping hole below the waterline. The ship shudders violently, a sickening groan echoing through its timbers, followed by the terrifying rush of water pouring in. Chaos erupts. Orders are shouted, but fear and panic quickly seize the crew. Men scramble for pumps, but the water rises relentlessly, cold and unforgiving. The ship begins to list, the deck becoming a dangerous, angled slope. Every second counts. Every movement is a desperate struggle against the inevitable. The once familiar sanctuary of the ship transforms into a death trap, slowly, inexorably pulling you down into the abyssal depths. If you are lucky, you might have enough time to scramble onto a lifeboat or a piece of floating debris. But these lifeboats were not the well-equipped, sturdy vessels of modern times. They were small, open wooden boats, often overcrowded with meager supplies, if any. Imagine being crammed shoulder to shoulder with desperate, terrified men, the boat pitching wildly in the waves, barely staying afloat. The fight for space and survival would be immediate and brutal. The weak, the injured, or those who simply couldn't cling on would be tossed into the churning waters, their desperate cries quickly swallowed by the roar of the ocean. Your new reality would be a tiny speck of wood in an infinite, hostile world. The sun would become your tormentor. Beating down relentlessly, it would quickly lead to severe sunburn, blistering your skin, and accelerating dehydration. There is no shade, no escape from its merciless glare. Your lips would crack, your tongue would swell, and your throat would burn with an unbearable thirst. The salt spray, constantly washing over the boat, would irritate your skin and eyes, and drinking it in desperation would only hasten your demise, poisoning your system and inducing terrifying hallucinations. The days would stretch into an agonizing eternity, each hour marked by the increasing torment of heat and thirst. Then comes the thirst. Oh, the thirst. More agonizing than hunger, it grips you, a burning, gnawing ache in your throat and stomach. Your body slowly dries out, your skin shrivels, your blood thickens. You watch as your companions succumb, their minds failing, their bodies convulsing, until they finally slip away, their last breath a rasping gasp. The desperation can drive men to horrific acts, drinking their own urine, or even, in the most extreme cases, resorting to cannibalism from the bodies of the recently deceased. The mental anguish of denying your body the most basic necessity while surrounded by an undrinkable ocean is a special kind of hell. Hunger, though secondary to thirst, would also begin its slow torment. Any meager provisions taken from the ship would quickly be consumed. Then, the grim reality of starvation sets in. Your body would begin to consume itself, drawing on fat reserves, then muscle, leaving you emaciated and incredibly weak. The lack of food would dull your senses, slow your thoughts, and ultimately lead to a profound lethargy. The only energy you expend would be in keeping yourself alive, clinging to the side of the boat as the waves relentlessly tried to dislodge you. Each day without food would be another step closer to a slow, agonizing death, your strength ebbing away with the passing hours. Exposure to the elements was constant. At night, the temperature would plummet, leaving you shivering uncontrollably, your body racked by hypothermia. The cold, wet conditions would make sleep impossible, and the constant exposure would weaken your immune system, making you vulnerable to any illness. During the day, the burning sun and the constant salt spray would take their toll. Your skin would crack and bleed, your eyes would become inflamed, and your overall physical state would rapidly deteriorate. There was no shelter, no relief from the relentless assault of wind, sun, and sea, sharks. The very thought sends shivers down the spine. In these waters, they were an ever-present menace, drawn by the scent of blood or the desperate struggles of men. Imagine seeing their dark fins circling your fragile craft, knowing that a single slip, a moment of weakness, could mean a swift and brutal end. Even if they didn't attack, their silent, predatory presence was a constant source of terror, a grim reminder of your vulnerability in their domain. The psychological toll of being hunted, of knowing you are simply waiting to become prey, is immense. Delirium and madness would often set in. Dehydration, starvation, and the sheer psychological trauma of the situation would erode your sanity. You might hallucinate, seeing phantom ships, oases, or loved ones in the shimmering heat haze. You might babble incoherently or become violent towards your fellow survivors, driven by paranoia and desperation. The line between reality and illusion would blur, making your final moments a terrifying descent into madness, alone in your own mind, even if surrounded by others. The agony of your body would be matched only by the torment of your broken mind. The prospect of rescue was astronomically small. The vastness of the ocean meant that passing ships were incredibly rare. There were no search and rescue operations, no beacons to signal your distress. You were truly alone, adrift in an indifferent world, your only hope a miraculous chance encounter. Days would turn into weeks and weeks into months, with nothing but the endless horizon. Hope, a fragile commodity, would slowly die, replaced by a grim acceptance of your inevitable fate. Every distant speck on the horizon would bring a fleeting surge of adrenaline, only to be crushed by the devastating realization that it was nothing but an illusion or a distant cloud. The final moments were often horrific. Whether it was the overwhelming thirst, the gnawing hunger, the freezing cold, the burning sun, or the relentless consumption by disease, death at sea was rarely quick or merciful. Your body would simply give out, your strength gone, your mind perhaps already lost to delirium. Your lifeless form would then be consigned to the deep, a silent end to a life of unimaginable struggle, your story lost to the waves. The age of exploration, for all its tales of glory, was also a story of countless anonymous deaths at sea, men swallowed by the indifferent ocean, their final moments a testament to the unforgiving brutality of a world beyond the edge of the map. Even when the immediate threats of storm, disease, or starvation receded, the long, monotonous stretches of ocean voyages in the age of exploration waged a relentless war on the human mind. The profound isolation, the unbroken monotony of the horizon, and the utter absence of familiar comforts combined to create a psychological crucible that few could endure unscathed. Your survival hinged not just on physical fortitude, but on battling the insidious erosion of your sanity, as despair and loneliness became as constant and tangible as the salt spray on your face. This wasn't just a journey across physical miles. It was a torturous descent into the depths of the human psyche, tested to its absolute breaking point. Imagine the sheer monotony. Day after day, week after week, the view remained unchanged. The endless expanse of gray-blue ocean meeting the equally endless sky. The only variations were the subtle shifts in cloud formations or the changing quality of light. There were no landmarks, no passing ships, usually, no fresh faces, no new conversations. The same handful of men, the same creaking timbers, the same limited activities. This relentless sameness, devoid of any meaningful stimulation, slowly wore down the mind. The brain, starved of novelty, would begin to turn inward, often leading to obsessive thoughts, repetitive behaviors, and a profound sense of tedium that bordered on agony. The profound isolation was crushing. You were thousands of miles from home, from family, from anything familiar. There was no communication with the outside world, no way to send or receive news. Your entire existence was confined to a small wooden vessel, a tiny speck in an unfathomable void. This absolute severance from humanity, from the very fabric of society, could lead to a chilling sense of abandonment and insignificance. The world you knew, your past life, seemed to recede into an unreachable dream, leaving you adrift not just on the ocean, but in a terrifying vacuum of existence. This was a loneliness so deep it could break the spirit of even the most hardened individual. Sleep, already a luxury due to discomfort and fear, was often invaded by terrifying dreams or disturbed by the pervasive sense of dread. When you did manage to drift off, your subconscious mind, working overtime to process the overwhelming trauma of your reality, might conjure vivid nightmares of storms, monsters, or your loved ones in peril. Waking from such dreams into the cold, damp, dark reality of the ship could be disorienting and deeply unsettling, blurring the lines between the horrors of your sleep and the horrors of your waking life. Rest offered no true escape, only a different kind of torment. The constant stress eroded social bonds. While camaraderie could form in shared suffering, it was often fragile and easily broken. The cramped quarters, the lack of privacy, the shared misery, and the ever-present hunger and thirst frayed nerves and shortened tempers. Small annoyances could escalate into violent arguments. Paranoia could set in, with men suspecting each other of stealing meager rations, shirking duties, or even conspiring against the captain. The trust that was vital for survival often dissolved, leaving each man feeling utterly alone, even amidst a crowd. The ship became a pressure cooker, turning comrades into wary adversaries. Hallucinations were not uncommon. Prolonged periods of sensory deprivation, combined with dehydration, malnutrition, and sleep deprivation, could cause the mind to play tricks. Sailors reported seeing phantom ships, hearing voices, or encountering mythical creatures that were not there. These vivid illusions could be terrifying or, paradoxically, a temporary escape from reality, but ultimately they were a sign of the mind beginning to unravel. For those already predisposed to mental instability or simply pushed beyond their limits, these hallucinations could herald a full descent into madness, leaving them babbling incoherently or attempting to throw themselves overboard. The loss of hope was a silent, creeping killer. Initially, the lure of riches or the promise of adventure might sustain morale. But as months turned into years, as hardships mounted, and as the death toll rose, that hope would slowly dwindle. The overwhelming scale of the journey, the relentless cycle of suffering, and the diminishing prospects of success or even survival would lead to profound despair. Apathy would set in, a dangerous resignation that robbed men of their will to fight, making them vulnerable to every new challenge. This was the ultimate psychological defeat, a complete surrender to the crushing indifference of the ocean. Depression was a constant shadow. The bleakness of the environment, the profound loneliness, the physical pain, and the overwhelming sense of doom combined to create an ideal breeding ground for severe melancholia. Men would become withdrawn, silent, their eyes losing their spark. They might refuse to eat, neglect their duties, or simply stare blankly at the waves, their minds trapped in a spiral of hopelessness. There was no understanding of mental health, no therapy, no support. A depressed sailor was merely seen as a shirker or a lost cause, often left to waste away, his suffering dismissed as weakness. The sheer unpredictability of the journey added to the mental strain. You never knew when the next storm would hit, when disease would strike, or when a hostile encounter would erupt. This constant state of vigilance, this perpetual anticipation of disaster was exhausting. Your body and mind were always on high alert, never truly able to relax. This sustained level of anxiety would eventually take its toll, leaving you jumpy, irritable, and prone to panic at the slightest provocation. The future was an unknown, terrifying blank, stretching endlessly before you. Even for those who made it back, the psychological scars would be profound and lasting. The horrors witnessed, the suffering endured, the friends lost, and the moral compromises made would leave an indelible mark. Many would return changed, unable to adapt to normal life, haunted by their experiences. They might suffer from nightmares, flashbacks, or a pervasive sense of detachment. The age of exploration was a grand adventure for the history books, but for the men who lived it, it was often a traumatic odyssey that scarred the soul, leaving them broken even if their bodies survived. In the age of exploration, the battle for survival was fought not just against nature, but against the very architecture of the human mind. The relentless onslaught of isolation, monotony, and despair proved to be as formidable an enemy as any gale or disease. To endure meant to somehow keep your mind from fracturing, to cling to the last vestiges of hope or sanity, knowing that the world you left behind might no longer exist, and the person you once were might be irrevocably lost to the vast, soul-crushing indifference of the open sea. When illness struck on a ship in the age of exploration, your chances of recovery plummeted to near zero. Forget the sterile environments and advanced knowledge of modern hospitals. You would be thrust into a world where medicine was rudimentary, often brutal, and frequently more dangerous than the illness itself. The ship's surgeon, if one was even aboard, operated with a knowledge base steeped in ancient theories and practices, utterly ill-equipped to combat the virulent diseases and severe injuries common at sea. Your every ailment, from a minor cut to a raging fever, held the potential for excruciating pain, disfigurement, and ultimately, a slow and agonizing death. Imagine the ship's sick bay, if such a dedicated space existed at all. More often, it would be a dimly lit, cramped corner of the lowest deck, perpetually damp and reeking of sickness and unwashed bodies. There would be no proper beds, perhaps just a few makeshift hammocks or blankets on the floor. Sanitation was non-existent. The air was thick with the groans of the afflicted, the stench of bodily fluids, and the pervasive reek of decay. This was not a place of healing, but a miserable holding pen for those awaiting their grim fate. To be sent to the sick bay was often tantamount to a death sentence, a final chapter in the grim ledger of maritime mortality. The ship's surgeon, often a barber by trade, possessed a limited understanding of human anatomy and an even poorer grasp of disease. His knowledge was based on the archaic humoral theory, which posited that illness was caused by an imbalance of 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Treatments, therefore, focused on restoring this balance, often through methods that were not only ineffective but actively harmful. You would be subjected to procedures that defy modern comprehension, all performed without anesthesia, in the most unsanitary conditions imaginable. Bloodletting was a cornerstone of treatment. If you had a fever, a headache, or almost any ailment, the immediate response would be to bleed you, either by cutting a vein or applying leeches. Imagine the terror of having a crude lancet pierce your skin, watching your life's blood drain into a bowl, believing it was somehow curing you, when in reality it was only weakening your already compromised body. This practice, based on the belief that bad blood caused illness, often left already anemic and dehydrated patients even more debilitated, making them more susceptible to other infections and accelerating their decline. Purging and vomiting were equally common. If bloodletting didn't work or was deemed inappropriate, the surgeon might administer powerful emetics or laxatives to induce violent vomiting or diarrhea. The rationale was to expel noxious humors from the body. Imagine the agonizing cramps, the repeated spasms, the complete loss of control over your bodily functions, all while your body was already struggling with illness. These treatments further dehydrated the patient and often left them too weak to recover, pushing them closer to the brink of death. Amputations were a horrifying reality for severe injuries. A shattered limb from a cannonball, a gangrenous wound from an untreated cut, these often necessitated the removal of the affected limb. Imagine the excruciating agony of having a limb severed with a crude, unsterilized saw, with no anesthesia beyond a swig of rum or a hard blow to the head to render you unconscious. The operation would be performed swiftly, brutally, amidst the screams of the patient. Post-amputation care was minimal, and infection, or fever, as it was often called, was almost guaranteed. The stumps would fester, reeking of putrefaction, and many who survived the initial trauma would succumb to sepsis within days or weeks. Dental care was virtually non-existent. A toothache, a common complaint due to poor diet, would be met with a brutal extraction, often performed with pliers or a hammer, leaving you with gaping, bleeding gums and further risk of infection. Imagine the agony of such a procedure, performed by a man with little skill beyond brute force, your jaw aching for days afterward. Oral hygiene was unheard of, contributing to rampant tooth decay and gum disease that made eating the tough ship's rations even more difficult and painful. The lack of understanding about hygiene and germ theory was perhaps the greatest killer. Surgical instruments were rarely, if ever, sterilized. The surgeon's hands, often covered in grime and blood from previous patients, would be plunged into open wounds. Bandages were reused, and the sick were often crammed together, ensuring that diseases spread like wildfire. The concept that invisible animalcules or germs caused illness was centuries away. Therefore, every attempt at treatment, every physical contact, every shared space, unwittingly became a vector for further infection, turning a single sick man into the catalyst for an epidemic. Pain management was primitive in the extreme. Beyond alcohol, opium might occasionally be available for severe pain, but it was rare and often reserved for officers. For the common sailor, agony was simply a part of the experience. You would lie in your own filth, racked with pain, fever, and nausea, your body a testament to unimaginable suffering, with no relief in sight. The strength of will required to simply exist in such a state, day after day, was beyond comprehension for a modern individual. The psychological toll of enduring such medical horrors was profound. Knowing that any illness or injury could mean unimaginable pain, disfigurement, or death, with little hope of effective treatment, added an immense layer of dread to an already terrifying existence. Watching your comrades suffer and die in agony, knowing that you might be next, eroded morale and instilled a pervasive sense of helplessness. The ship's surgeon, meant to be a healer, was often seen with a mixture of fear and grim resignation, his arrival often signaling a worsening of symptoms rather than a path to recovery. In essence, surviving illness in the age of exploration was less about effective medical intervention and more about sheer luck and an incredibly robust constitution. The medical practices of the era, coupled with the horrific conditions aboard ship, meant that your body was a constant battleground. To last a day, let alone a prolonged voyage, meant enduring unimaginable suffering when sickness struck, facing procedures that would make you cringe, and accepting a fate where comfort and recovery were rarely, if ever, part of the grim prognosis. This was a testament not to the healing arts, but to the brutal reality of human vulnerability against the microscopic terrors of disease. Even if you managed to survive the harrowing sea voyage, the brutal discipline on board, the slow ravages of disease, and the crushing psychological toll of isolation. Your arrival in the New World presented a fresh and unrelenting set of environmental challenges. The lands being explored were not the temperate, familiar landscapes of Europe, but wild, alien ecosystems, utterly hostile to the uninitiated. Your European resilience, forged in a different climate, would be utterly inadequate, leaving you exposed and vulnerable to the relentless, often subtle cruelty of a natural world that seemed actively determined to destroy you. This wasn't merely a backdrop for adventure. It was a living, breathing adversary that would attack your body, mind, and spirit with unrelenting force. Imagine the sheer unpreparedness for the tropical heat. If your expedition took you to the Americas, Africa, or Asia, you would be immediately assaulted by a humid, suffocating heat, unlike anything you had ever experienced. Your heavy wool and linen clothing, perfectly suited for the chill of European winters, would become an unbearable burden, clinging to your sweat-soaked skin, chafing and causing painful rashes. Your body, accustomed to cooler climes, would struggle to regulate its temperature, leading to rapid dehydration, heat stroke, and profound exhaustion. Every movement would be an immense effort, every breath shallow and unsatisfying. The sun, a welcome warmth in Europe, would become a tyrannical master, burning your exposed skin and causing debilitating headaches. There was no escape, no cool breeze, only the oppressive, relentless weight of the tropical sun beating down on you day after day, slowly cooking you from the inside out. And then came the rain, not the gentle showers of Europe, but torrential, ceaseless downpours of the rainy season. Imagine marching for days through a landscape transformed into a vast swamp, the ground a treacherous quagmire, every step a struggle. Your clothes would be perpetually soaked, clinging to your body, chilling you to the bone even in warm climates. Rivers would swell into impassable torrents, sweeping away men and supplies. Your camp, if you managed to make one, would be a miserable, muddy mess, with no way to dry your clothes or find true warmth. The constant dampness would lead to rampant skin infections, trench foot, and a pervasive sense of cold, damp misery that seeped into your very bones, making rest impossible and sleep a shivering nightmare. The plant life itself could be a silent killer. Imagine hacking your way through dense, impenetrable jungle, every branch covered in thorns, every leaf capable of causing irritating rashes or painful stings. Unfamiliar plants could be highly poisonous if ingested, or their sap could cause severe burns on contact. The dense foliage concealed unseen dangers, limiting visibility and making every step a gamble. You would be utterly ignorant of which plants offered food or medicine and which carried toxins. The jungle was not a place of beauty, but a chaotic, living labyrinth designed to entrap, injure, and ultimately consume any who dared to penetrate its depths. Wildlife, too, presented an entirely new spectrum of threats. Forget the wolves or bears of European folklore. Now you faced an array of creatures far more alien and terrifying. Jaguars and pumas, silent stalkers of the dense forests, could ambush you without warning. Crocodiles lurked in murky rivers, their silent presence a constant threat during water crossings. Venomous snakes, spiders, and scorpions, often hidden in the undergrowth or within your very campsite, carried deadly poisons that could bring a swift, agonizing end. Even seemingly innocuous insects like mosquitoes were carriers of debilitating and often fatal diseases like malaria and yellow fever, their bites a subtle yet omnipresent death sentence. You were a clumsy, vulnerable invader in a world where every rustle in the leaves could mean a deadly encounter. The terrain itself was often a formidable obstacle. Imagine traversing vast, scorching deserts with no water for days, your body screaming for hydration as the sand burned your feet. Or scaling treacherous mountain ranges, battling thin air, bitter cold, and the constant risk of rock slides. Swamps and marshes, teeming with unseen creatures and quicksand-like traps, could swallow entire expeditions. The ground beneath your feet was not simply a pathway, but a constantly shifting, unpredictable enemy. Each step a potential pitfall, a twisted ankle, or a fatal fall. Your body, already weakened by malnutrition and disease, would be pushed to its absolute breaking point by these relentless physical demands. New diseases, often carried by native insects or local water sources, added another layer of terror. Beyond the European plagues you brought with you, you would be exposed to entirely new pathogens to which your body had no immunity. Fevers that left you delirious and convulsing, debilitating stomach ailments, and strange skin infections would emerge, unknown to your rudimentary medical knowledge. You were entering a biological landscape as alien as the human cultures, and your body was utterly unprepared for the invisible microscopic warfare waged by local flora and fauna. Every breath, every drink of water, every insect bite was a potential gateway for a novel and deadly affliction. The lack of proper shelter and equipment exacerbated every environmental challenge. You slept in the open or in hastily constructed lean-tos, offering little protection from rain, sun, or biting insects. Your clothing was inadequate, your shoes quickly wore out, and your tools were crude. There were no maps that accurately depicted the terrain, no guides who truly understood your needs, and no means of rapid communication or rescue if you became lost or stranded. You were essentially blind and naked in a hostile wilderness, relying solely on your diminishing wits and physical strength to survive. Even the simple act of finding food and water became a life-or-death struggle. The European diet was unsustainable in these new environments. You had to rely on hunting, fishing, and foraging, skills many sailors or soldiers lacked. Many indigenous plants were poisonous, and those that were edible were unfamiliar. Rivers might be contaminated or dry up unexpectedly. The constant hunt for sustenance consumed vast amounts of energy and time, often yielding meager results, further weakening your already starving body. Every meal was a gamble, every drink a potential poison, turning the most basic human needs into monumental, deadly challenges. The psychological toll of this constant environmental assault was immense. The feeling of being perpetually vulnerable, of battling an omnipresent, invisible enemy that was the land itself, slowly eroded morale. The sheer indifference of nature, its immense power demonstrated through storms, heat, and deadly creatures, fostered a deep sense of insignificance and despair. You were not mastering this new world. You were desperately struggling to merely exist within it, a tiny, fragile intruder constantly on the verge of being swallowed whole by its untamed forces. In conclusion, the age of exploration was not just a quest for new lands and riches. It was a brutal, relentless confrontation with environments for which European bodies and knowledge were utterly unsuited. To last a day meant enduring a constant barrage of heat, humidity, cold, rain, and the unseen terrors of unfamiliar flora and fauna. Your survival would be a testament not to human conquest, but to the sheer, stubborn resilience of a body pushed beyond all conceivable limits, and a mind clinging desperately to the last shreds of hope amidst an indifferent, overwhelming natural world determined to reclaim its dominion. Should you have survived the initial landings, the conflicts, the diseases, and the unforgiving nature of the new environments, you might find your prospects taking an even darker turn, being forced into labor, either by your own superiors or, far worse, by a rival European power or indigenous group. The age of exploration, for all its grand narratives of discovery, was fundamentally an age of resource extraction, driven by a relentless demand for gold, silver, crops, and manpower. For the common person, this often translated into a life of brutal, dehumanizing servitude, where your body was merely a tool to be worked until it broke. Your survival in this scenario would hinge on enduring unimaginable physical torment and the utter obliteration of your autonomy. Imagine being pressed into mining. Whether it was the silver mountains of Potosi or the gold rivers of New Spain, the mines were literal hell on earth. You would be forced to descend into dark, suffocating shafts, the air thick with dust that would slowly destroy your lungs. The work was ceaseless, performed with crude tools in cramped, dangerous conditions. Rock falls, explosions from gunpowder, and falls down deep shafts were common occurrences. The heat below ground was stifling, and the lack of ventilation led to dizziness and fainting spells. You would spend endless hours hacking at rock, hauling heavy loads of ore, your body aching with every movement, your muscles burning. There was no concept of safety or workers' rights. Your life was expendable, your value measured only by the amount of precious metal you could extract. If not mining, perhaps you were forced into agricultural labor. The vast plantations of the Caribbean or Brazil, producing sugar, tobacco, or cotton, were equally brutal. Imagine working from dawn until dusk under the scorching tropical sun, wielding a heavy machete or hoe, clearing dense jungle, planting crops, or processing raw materials. The labor was relentless, supervised by cruel overseers who thought nothing of flogging or maiming those who faltered. Your back would ache, your hands would blister, and your body would be constantly pushed beyond its limits. The diet would be meager, barely enough to sustain the energy needed for such backbreaking work. You were simply another beast of burden, worked until you dropped, and then replaced. The discipline in these labor camps was often more vicious and systematic than aboard a ship. While a captain might be a despot, the sheer scale of colonial exploitation required a more institutionalized form of terror. Overseers and guards, often armed, wielded absolute power. Any perceived slowness, any sign of resistance, any attempt to escape would be met with horrific public punishments designed to break the spirit and deter others. Floggings, mutilations, and tortures were commonplace, turning your daily life into a constant state of fear and physical pain. You were not treated as a human being, but as property, and the owners felt no compunction about destroying property if it failed to serve its purpose. The environment of forced labor camps was a breeding ground for disease. Overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, lack of clean water, and constant exposure to the elements meant that illnesses like dysentery, smallpox, and various fevers swept through the enslaved population with devastating speed. Malnutrition and exhaustion further weakened bodies, making them susceptible to every pathogen. The death rate in these labor camps was astronomically high, often leading to a constant need for fresh labor, perpetuating the cruel cycle of capture and enslavement. You would work alongside men and women who were visibly wasting away, their bodies succumbing to the twin scourges of overwork and sickness, knowing that their fate could soon be your own. The sheer dehumanization was soul-crushing. Your identity would be stripped away. You might be given a new name, forced to abandon your language and customs, and separated from any remaining family or community ties. You were no longer an individual with dreams or aspirations, but a unit of labor, valued only for your capacity to produce. This systematic stripping away of humanity, combined with the constant physical pain and fear, aimed to break your will, to reduce you to a docile, compliant servant. The psychological impact of such an existence where every day was a battle for survival devoid of dignity, was perhaps the most insidious form of torture. Escape was a desperate, often futile gamble. The vast, unknown wilderness surrounding the plantations or mines might seem like a path to freedom, but it was also filled with dangers: unfamiliar terrain, hostile wildlife, lack of food and water, and the ever-present threat of recapture by slave catchers and their dogs. If caught, the punishment would be so horrific as to deter any future attempts, often involving severe mutilation or death as a public warning. The choice was often between a slow death from labor or a quick, brutal end, attempting to gain a fleeting moment of freedom. The loss of hope was an insidious enemy. For some, the sheer enormity of their suffering, the endless cycle of labor and punishment, would extinguish any spark of resistance. They would fall into a state of deep despair, their eyes vacant, their spirits broken. Others, however, against all odds, would cling to a flicker of hope, fueling small acts of defiance, a quiet resilience, or the enduring dream of freedom. But for many, especially those who witnessed the constant stream of deaths around them, hope was a luxury they could no longer afford, leaving them to simply endure until their bodies could take no more. The age of exploration was not solely about finding new lands. It was about conquering and exploiting them, and that exploitation required vast amounts of coerced labor. If you were unlucky enough to fall into the hands of these systems, whether as a European captive of a rival power, or even more likely, as an indigenous person forced into servitude, your experience would be one of unimaginable suffering. Your life would be reduced to a cycle of pain, exhaustion, and dehumanization, your body pushed to its breaking point, your spirit systematically crushed. To last a day in this brutal reality meant enduring a living hell, where the only hope was often the release that death would ultimately bring. Even if, against all odds, your body endured the constant torments of the sea, the land, disease, and forced labor, the age of exploration offered a different kind of slow, insidious death for your spirit, the crushing weight of disillusionment and betrayal. Many who embarked on these perilous voyages were lured by grand, glittering promises of wealth, glory, and a new life free from the grinding poverty of Europe. But for the vast majority of common sailors, soldiers, and laborers, these promises proved to be cruel mirages, shattering under the harsh light of reality. Your survival would mean witnessing and often experiencing firsthand a systematic betrayal of trust, leaving you with little more than scars and the bitter taste of shattered dreams. Imagine the initial excitement, the heady dreams whispered on the docks. Tales of golden cities, mountains of silver, exotic spices, and vast lands just waiting to be claimed. You might have envisioned returning home a rich man, a hero, able to provide for your family and escape the endless cycle of toil. This hope, fragile as it was, served as a powerful motivator, pushing you through the darkest moments. But with each passing month, with each new hardship, and with each death, that glittering vision would dim, replaced by the grim, mundane reality of suffering. The age of exploration was, for most, a grand deception, a cruel bait-and switch that exchanged abstract promises for concrete agony. The most immediate betrayal often came from your own leadership. Captains and expedition leaders, driven by their own ambitions for fame and fortune, frequently prioritized their objectives over the well-being of their crew. Promises of fair shares of plunder often evaporated upon discovery of any real wealth, with the lion's share reserved for the crown, investors, and the officers. Your life, your health, your very existence was expendable in the pursuit of their glory. If you fell ill, you might be abandoned. If you questioned an order, you faced brutal punishment. If you were deemed a hindrance, you were simply cast aside. The captain, once seen as a benevolent provider of opportunity, would reveal himself to be a ruthless taskmaster, willing to sacrifice any number of lives for his own gain. The crown itself, and the distant investors who funded these voyages, often proved equally indifferent. They demanded results, riches, and new territories, but offered little in the way of support or genuine concern for the common men who risked everything. Bureaucracy was slow, justice non-existent, and complaints from the lower ranks rarely reached ears that cared. You were merely a statistic, a replaceable cog in the vast imperial machine. The sense of being used, of being sacrificed for the distant whims of power, would foster a profound resentment, eroding any lingering loyalty you might have felt towards the distant authorities who sent you to your likely doom. The riches you were promised were often illusory or agonizingly difficult to acquire. Gold was not lying on the ground waiting to be picked up. It was deep within dangerous mines, guarded by hostile tribes or already claimed by rival powers. Even if a treasure was found, its acquisition usually came at the cost of immense suffering, bloodshed, and further loss of life. And if you did manage to survive long enough to participate in a successful plunder, the true wealth rarely reached the hands of the common sailor. It was siphoned off, taxed, divided amongst officers, and often quickly gambled away or squandered in the brief, drunken revelry of port towns, leaving you with little to show for your years of agony. The loss of companions, once a grim inevitability, would deepen the sense of betrayal. You would watch friends, comrades with whom you had shared unimaginable hardships, succumb to disease, starvation, or violence. Their bodies would be unceremoniously cast into the sea, their belongings quickly divided. There was no time for mourning, no opportunity for proper farewells. This constant, brutal attrition, coupled with the dehumanizing disposal of bodies, fostered a chilling sense of disposability. Your life, you would realize, was just as cheap, just as insignificant as theirs. The camaraderie, once a source of strength, became a source of profound grief and a chilling reminder of your own precarious mortality. Even your own moral compass would be compromised. The brutal realities of conquest forced you to participate in, or at least witness, unspeakable atrocities against indigenous populations. The burning of villages, the torture of captives, the systematic enslavement, these acts would scar your soul. The justifications offered by your superiors, often rooted in religious zeal or racial superiority, would provide little comfort as you faced the horrifying consequences of your actions. You would return, if you returned at all, a changed person, perhaps haunted by guilt, or perhaps utterly desensitized, the lines between right and wrong irrevocably blurred by the grim necessities of survival in a barbaric world. And what of the return home, if it ever came? You would return a ghost of your former self, emaciated, scarred, perhaps crippled, and likely suffering from unseen psychological wounds. The world you left behind might have moved on without you. Your family might be gone, having assumed you were lost to the sea. The community you remembered might feel alien, its concerns trivial compared to the horrors you had witnessed. Your stories, if you even dared to tell them, might be met with skepticism or dismissive pity. The grand return you fantasized about would be replaced by a bleak, lonely reintegration into a world that no longer quite fit, leaving you feeling like a stranger in your own land. Often you might find yourself bound by debt, not truly free even upon your return. The initial advances, the cost of equipment, or even fines incurred during the voyage might mean that any meager pay you received was already owed away. Your years of suffering would amount to nothing but further servitude, chained not by irons, but by economic circumstance. The promise of freedom, like the promise of riches, would prove to be a bitter lie, perpetuating the cycle of despair. Ultimately, to last a day in the age of exploration meant enduring not just physical pain but the profound, corrosive agony of betrayal. It meant watching your dreams turn to dust, your hopes wither, and your moral compass spin wildly out of control. It meant realizing that the very venture that promised you salvation was, in fact, consuming your very soul, leaving you with nothing but bitter memories and the crushing realization that you had sacrificed everything for nothing. This disillusionment was a permanent scar, far deeper than any physical wound, a testament to the brutal reality behind the celebrated tales of exploration. Even if, by some miracle, you were one of the rare few who survived the age of exploration, who endured the storms, the scurvy, the brutal discipline, the endless hunger, the hostile lands, and the crushing despair, your story, your unimaginable suffering would, for the most part, be swallowed by the silence of history. The grand narratives of discovery are written by and about the captains, the conquistadors, the patrons, and the cartographers. For the vast legions of common sailors, soldiers, and forced laborers, their lives and their deaths passed largely unrecorded, leaving behind no legacy but the chilling, unacknowledged truth of mass suffering. Your endurance, your unimaginable struggle to last even a single day, would in the end be a forgotten whisper in the vast, indifferent winds of time. Imagine, first, the sheer anonymity of death. For every famous explorer whose name is etched in textbooks, there were hundreds, thousands, even tens of thousands of ordinary men who perished on these voyages. Their bodies, racked by disease or shattered by violence, were not interred in hallowed ground. Most were simply sewn into canvas shrouds, a weight tied to their feet, and committed to the cold, impersonal embrace of the ocean. Their grave was the endless deep, unmarked by stone or epitaph. No one would ever visit their resting place. No one would ever bring flowers. Their names, if they were even recorded in the ship's log beyond a simple tally, would quickly be forgotten, dissolved into the vast, anonymous statistics of maritime mortality. Their stories, their individual pains, vanished with their last breath. The records kept during these expeditions were rarely concerned with the individual common man. Ship logs meticulously detailed courses, weather, cargo, and official events, but the daily lives and sufferings of the crew were largely overlooked. A line might note a death, perhaps attributing it to fever or flux, but it seldom delved into the agonizing details of a man's final days, his last thoughts, or the family he left behind. You were a unit of labor, a replaceable resource, not an individual deserving of narrative. Your existence was defined by your utility, and once that utility ceased, you became a mere footnote, if anything at all, in the annals of a captain's journey. The sheer scale of death contributed to this profound anonymity. When half or even two-thirds of a crew could perish on a single voyage, individual deaths became commonplace, a grim routine. The living, constantly battling for their own survival, had no time or emotional capacity to mourn each loss deeply. The deceased were simply removed, their absence noted, and their duties absorbed by others. This normalization of death, this constant exposure to mortality, stripped away the sanctity of individual life, reducing each passing to a simple, unavoidable consequence of the venture. Your demise would likely be met with a sigh of grim resignation, not a tearful farewell. Consider the contrast with modern sensibilities. Today, we strive to remember every name, to honor every fallen soldier, every lost traveler. But in the age of exploration, human life, particularly that of the lower classes, was cheap. The desperate poverty and lack of opportunity in Europe meant there was an endless supply of men willing to risk everything for a chance at escape or fortune. This constant influx of expendable labor reinforced the idea that individual lives were secondary to the grander imperial ambitions. You were part of a vast human current, sweeping across the globe, and if you were swept away, another would quickly fill your place. Even if you managed to return, your story might remain untold or unheard. Who would listen? The wealthy patrons and educated elite were interested in maps, treasures, and new territories, not the raw, unvarnished horrors experienced by a common sailor. Your account of scurvy, brutal floggings, or the terrifying reality of battle might be dismissed as exaggeration, or simply too unpleasant to contemplate. Without literacy, without connections, without a platform, your voice was silent, your testimony lost. The heroic narratives of conquest and discovery would drown out the quiet desperation of the countless individuals who actually made those journeys possible. The vast distances and the fragmented nature of these expeditions also contributed to the lost legacy. Men from different towns, different regions, often without families waiting, would join these crews. If they died, their distant homes might never know their fate. There were no official notification systems, no proper means to inform loved ones. Families waited, often in vain, for years, eventually concluding that their son or brother had simply vanished, swallowed by the sea or the unknown lands. Their memory faded, becoming a quiet sorrow, but never a public commemoration. The very concept of discovery itself was built upon this foundation of silent suffering. The new lands were not empty. They were inhabited by diverse peoples whose own histories and civilizations were utterly disregarded or actively destroyed. Their suffering, their deaths, their forced labor formed an even larger, more tragic, and even less acknowledged part of the age of exploration's human cost. If the suffering of a European commoner was largely ignored, the suffering of the indigenous populations was systematically erased, their lives and their legacies annihilated in the ruthless march of colonial expansion. Your ultimate fate, even if you made it home, was rarely glorious. The few who returned might be broken men, physically ravaged, mentally scarred, and often without any lasting wealth. They carried the burden of their experiences, the horrors they witnessed and the friends they lost, often with no one to truly understand their ordeal. They were survivors, yes, but survivors bearing an invisible weight that would never truly lift. Their legacy was often just a quiet, painful existence, a testament to what they had endured rather than what they had achieved. In essence, to last a day, let alone months or years, in the age of exploration meant to step into a period where individual suffering was cheap, and individual memory even cheaper. You would fight, bleed, starve, and endure unimaginable horrors, all for a cause that would ultimately forget you. Your grave would be the vast, unfeeling ocean, or an unmarked patch of earth in a foreign land, your name whispered only by the waves or the winds. The true history of the age of exploration is not just in the triumphs and discoveries, but in the silent, anonymous suffering of the countless individuals whose lives were consumed by its brutal, indifferent march across the globe. As our long, somber voyage through the age of exploration draws to a close, let us reflect, in the quiet darkness, on the overwhelming cumulative toll exacted by this period. It was not a singular danger that would have ensured your swift demise, but a relentless, overlapping barrage of them. From the moment you stepped onto that groaning wooden ship, you would have been thrust into a world where every single aspect of your existence, every breath you took, every meal you ate, every interaction you had, was designed to test the very limits of human endurance. To last even a single day, let alone a single voyage, in this brutal crucible was not a matter of heroism, but of sheer, improbable, almost unfathomable luck. And even for the lucky few, the price of survival was often a profound and irreversible transformation. Imagine, if you somehow returned, the physical shell that would be left of you. Your body, once perhaps robust, would be emaciated, riddled with scars from untreated wounds, old and new. Your skin might be permanently discolored by sun and scurvy, your teeth perhaps lost, your limbs aching with chronic pain from injuries that never healed properly. Your bones would have known the deep ache of constant dampness and chilling cold. You would move with a weary gait, your muscles atrophied, your strength severely diminished. The very act of standing tall, of walking without a limp, might be a forgotten luxury. This was not the physique of a triumphant adventurer, but of a survivor of prolonged torture, a living testament to the relentless physical attrition of the sea and the land. But the physical scars were often just the most visible markers of a deeper, more insidious damage. The mind, too, would be irrevocably altered. You would carry with you the haunting images of your comrades dying, their bodies silently consigned to the deep. The screams of men under the lash, the terrifying roar of a hurricane, the silent watch for hostile eyes in an alien jungle, these sensory imprints would be etched into your memory, replaying in your restless sleep. You might suffer from persistent nightmares, from flashbacks that transported you back to the deck of a storm-tossed ship or the stench of a disease-ridden hold. The constant state of fear, the perpetual anxiety, and the profound isolation would leave you jumpy, withdrawn, perhaps prone to fits of rage or bouts of deep melancholia. Your spirit, too, would bear indelible marks. The innocence you might have carried, the naive hope for adventure or riches, would be long gone, replaced by a bitter cynicism. You would have witnessed unimaginable cruelty, both inflicted by your own kind and endured by countless others. The moral lines that once seemed so clear would have blurred, forcing you to participate in acts you once deemed unthinkable, simply to survive. This dehumanization, this chipping away at your inherent dignity, would leave a hollow space within, a profound sense of loss that could never truly be filled. You would be a stranger to your former self, a ghost in your own memories. The grand promises that lured so many into this perilous age would have been revealed as cruel illusions. The mountains of gold, the vast tracts of land, the noble pursuit of discovery, for the common man, these were rarely achieved. Instead, there was endless toil, profound suffering, and often an anonymous death. The wealth that was extracted fueled the distant empires, lined the pockets of the elite, and financed further ventures of exploitation. For you, the individual, the age of exploration would have been a grand, tragic gamble where the stakes were your very life and soul, and the odds of true reward were astronomically stacked against you. Consider the irony of these historical narratives. We speak of discovery, advancement, and the expansion of civilization, often glossing over the unspeakable human cost. The maps filled in, the trade routes established, the empires built, these were paved with the suffering of countless individuals, their struggles largely invisible in the grand sweep of history. Your personal agony, your silent battles against scurvy and thirst, against the lash and the threat of abandonment, were merely the unwritten footnotes to the triumph of powerful nations and ambitious men. The age of exploration was indeed revolutionary, but its foundations were built upon a vast, unacknowledged sea of human misery. Even if you managed to carve out some semblance of a life upon return, the quiet dignity of simply existing would be a profound achievement. You would likely live out your days as an ordinary person, your extraordinary experiences locked within, misunderstood or dismissed by those who had never known the vast indifference of the ocean, or the chilling silence of a foreign wilderness. Your heroism was not in conquering lands or claiming riches, but simply in enduring, in persisting, in finding a way to breathe one more breath, to survive one more agonizing day against overwhelming odds. This quiet resilience, this stubborn refusal to yield, was the true, unsung heroism of the era. And as we drift through these sleepy reflections, let the heavy weight of this history settle over you. The age of exploration was not a romantic adventure for the common person. It was a crucible of suffering, a relentless grinder of human lives. To last a day, to endure even a single fleeting moment in its grim embrace, would have tested every fiber of your being physically, mentally, and spiritually. So, as the shadows deepen and the world outside fades, find solace in the knowledge that you live in a different time, a time where such profound suffering is, mercifully, a distant echo from the past.